So this actually, without much planning, ties rather closely with what Philippe has just done. And if any of you who got up this morning and actually got to breakfast in time for the panel on complexity will see that there's also a certain family resemblance, not coincidentally, since I got interested in computers about 37 years ago by discovering agent-based simulation models in their, let's say, in their infant state. But I'm talking about the innovation economy and why it is important to take waste seriously. Now, neoclassical economics, and this should say the virtue of neoclassical economics, is efficiency. And neoclassical economics, no need to rehearse this for this audience, but in focusing on optimal allocation of resources to satisfy stable preferences, defines an economy that is essentially and necessarily static. I'm not going to linger on this because there's more important stuff to talk about. Why waste? Why, in fact, in the economy that we've actually live in, and the one that has since, say, the mid-18th century, been driven through historical time by waves of technological innovation, why is waste an attribute of that process? Breaking the innovation process down into three phases, which should not, although it's incredibly powerfully tempting to think of it as a strictly linear process. There's feedback in the lived experience at every one of these phases. But if you think of the discovery invention, scientific discovery, technological invention as the kind of upstream to accept, if you like, the simplistics of a linear model, deployment, when new technology, and particularly the major network technologies, are deployed. And then finally, that deployment itself creates new economic space. And the process of exploring that space to find out what is actually commercially useful that can be done now that could not be done before, that's the third phase. And as you'll see, my argument here is that phases 1 and 3 are necessarily pursued by trial and error and error and error. Waste is the essence of the process. The generation of waste is essential. Only the second phase can be efficiently deployed, but only, in fact, it turns out, by the state. Now, I want to make a distinction here between two kinds of waste. I'm calling the first Keynesian waste I simply mean, if you like, inadequate demand, unused resources, the marginal productivity of which is negative. I'm not going to talk about that much because I really want to focus on Schumpeterian waste, the waste generated in the innovation process that I've just described. I do want to note that on its own, without the state, the market economy is, as we have seen, and as indeed Keynes and others have discussed, generates too much Keynesian waste, and it generates not enough Schumpeterian waste. And this is where, and the last point of kicking neoclassical economics one more time, of course, neoclassical economics plays a critical role in encouraging the toleration of Keynesian waste by insisting that government spending be evaluated on a project-by-project basis in terms of its usefulness and productivity. And it also can serve to undermine and to limit the toleration of Schumpeterian waste by, again, insisting on the definition of an economic or even a financial return before state investments are made, when by definition we're only going to find out what the return is by living through the process. Now, so in brief, scientific discovery has always been funded by sources that are unconcerned with any kind of near-term financial or economic return. Darwin's father was a very successful angel investor. He lived as a rentier. He was able to indulge his research entirely without concern for economic return. From the late 19th century through to the 1970s, the innovation process, the upstream process, took place at places like AT&T, Murray Hill, Bell Labs, et cetera. These were the surplus rents paid for them, generated by the great monopolies that were, if not formally sanctioned, like AT&T, were tolerated by the state. When their monopoly rents were either taken away or competed away over time, and when innovators' dilemma caught up with them, it turned out that the state, and particularly the American state, was there with the Defense Department and the NIH. The point here, of course, is that the state's investment was not rationalized in terms of market failure. It was rationalized in terms of absolutes unconnected with direct economic return, national security, and human health. And I will just briefly mention that I think the danger of applying efficient criteria to scientific discovery is very great. And right now, both in Britain and the United States, I'm not as well informed about Europe, but in Britain and in the United States, I think that's a very clear and present danger. I don't think anybody could invent this acronym STAR metrics, which is now being applied to all federal funding of science and technology. You can read it for yourself, but the notion is that the investment in science and technology has to be rationalized in terms of, if you like, neoclassical economics. Now, with respect to deployment, there are alternatives. There's a fine book by Fred Dobbin on the railroads, the deployment of the railroad networks in Britain, France, and the United States in the first half of the 19th century. In the UK and the US, completely unplanned. Speculators financed the development of entirely redundant railroads, lots of bankruptcies, lots of consolidation. In France, it was all done by the Court of Engineers. Indeed, they relied on Rothschild and others to raise them speculative money in the financial markets, but the French had, from the beginning, an entirely Paris-centric, efficient system. It can be done there. To an extent, it was also done, and Tom Hughes' great work on electrification, when the job was turned over to state-sanctioned monopolies. But at the last stage, the stage of economic discovery, this is very poorly done by the state, very poorly done. And this is where the inefficient wastefulness of bubbles comes into its own. Brad did a piece in Wired magazine back in '03 after the dot-com bubble bust, in which he compared that to the railroad booms and specifically identified Montgomery Ward and Sears as the killer apps of the railroads. And today, obviously, it took the enormous wastefulness of the dot-com telecom bubble to give us Amazon and Google and Facebook. And the way I think of it is that the state, or the state's instruments, the great monopolies, funded the construction of a platform for entrepreneurs and venture capitalists to dance on. And it's not something I'm going to go into here, but it turns out that only where the state did that, in information technology and biotechnology, have venture capitalists had any success at all. It's entirely there where the venture capitalists have played and played with success. I have an article which anybody who's interested in I can show to demonstrate that. Now, without going into the bubble literature, I just want to express the point of what John Eatwell has called useful bubbles. I refer to the necessity of bubbles. Given the endogeneity of bubbles, given their banality, that they are always emerging wherever there's a liquid a market in financial assets, there will be bubbles. And most of the time, the object of the bubble, whether it's tulips or third homes on the Florida coast, is a distraction from the Schumpeterian process of growth and increased productivity. Occasionally, it has been, from the canals in the late 18th century to the internet today, a technological innovation of profound economic significance. And that's why I think we have to be a little careful about banishing bubbles. It's the credit bubbles that suck in the banking system that cause the really big damage. the equity bubbles like the dot-com telecom are survivable. And if we were to banish them, we would lose something. We might not lose all the world, as Jack Falstaff told Prince Hal, but we would lose something important in the dynamics of an innovation economy. I won't even talk about the next new economy except to say it's too soon. Certainly in the US, the necessary investment in the upstream science and technology is really not taking place. The venture guys in Silicon Valley who are trying to do clean tech now are themselves, in effect, trying to fund science, technological invention way before that platform has been constructed. It is, of course, in China, where according to the Pew annual report on clean tech investment and clean tech R&D, which outspent the United States 2-to-1 in 2009, it's there, it appears, if anywhere, that platform is being constructed. So here's the conundrum. Here is the ironic conundrum about tolerating waste. It seems that in Europe, North America, in the developed world, we have a high tolerance, a relatively high tolerance for Keynesian waste. No doubt, going back to the story about the Reagan-Thatcher counter-revolution, the Lucasian counter-revolution at the intellectual theoretical grounds, and we have a relatively low tolerance, it appears, post the Cold War, except perhaps in the area of human health, for investing in Schumpeterian waste. And the message that I would take from the political economy of the investment in Schumpeterian growth is that Ken Arrow and Dick Nelson notwithstanding, market failure is not and never really has been an adequate rationale for this kind of investment. It was the Cold War, it was the pursuit of human health that justified it. It may be, with respect to clean tech, we're going to have to wait until we lose the Greenland ice cap and Palm Beach is under 2 meters of water before we have not a Sputnik moment, but a Pearl Harbor moment, and get moving. Finally, I think the events of the last 3 years have confirmed this sort of way of thinking about the innovation economy and the role of the pursuit of or the priority given to efficiency, particularly in efficiency in government spending, that again has, if you like, contributed to renewing the commitment to Keynesian waste, undermining the investment in Schumpeterian waste, and I will leave it with that. Thank you.